Welcome everyone to today's adult education session. So we've got all of our hybrid space hooked up for the table here, and we are so honored to welcome two members of the church and residents at Pilgrim Place, Paul and his spouse, Janet and her spouse, Paul.
Either way.
Either way. And so they're going to be presenting about a new book that has been published that is definitely worthy of a read, entitled Organizing Justice Church. And so a little bit of background, you may already know Paul and Janet, but Paul worked as a pastor in several different settings, urban, suburban, downtown. He was a director at a theological training center. He did full-time organizing against the Vietnam War. And he also worked in the UCC's public policy office in Washington, D.C. And so has a lot of background in doing social justice work and was focusing on this, particularly in the 1960s, and trying to understand what role the church had in organizing social justice work. Janet has been doing this alongside him in addition to her role as an attorney. Both of them have served in several capacities here at the church. Paul, you were an associate pastor here. Janet, you've served in a lot of boards and committees, and in our time, you were on the Staff Parish Relations Committee. So long-time church members and heavily involved. And so we are so excited to hear about this book. Just one other little biographical tidbit: in the narthex, you'll also find one of Paul's paintings. He is an artist in addition to being an author. So it's one of the ones hanging up in the narthex that looks, it's kind of a take on creation. So we're honored to welcome them both. If you could give them a round of applause. And I'll turn the mic over. You're first?
Yeah. Well, congratulations. You beat by almost a factor of 2 the number of people we guessed were going to show up this morning. We guessed 5, but so it's kind of recognition of, I used to be somebody. I haven't been around in a while, and so forth. Thank you for being here. I think the quickest way I could tell you what this book is all about is to say, about 5 years ago, I read this book. The title is Justice Church, The New Function of the Church in North American Christianity. The writer is Frederick Herzog, who's a friend of mine, was a friend of mine, died 2 years ago. He's a theologian at Duke Divinity School, and he worked with a group of North American scholars to try to appropriate what they could out of the Latin American liberation theology, and ask themselves, what out of that South American experience, what does that help? How does that help us understand our task as a church? And well, let me just say, since I'm at this point, the church primarily has understood itself to be, its main purpose is to save souls, and love is the primary product that we're offering to people as a way of speaking in their lives. This book is the conclusion of this group of scholars, and they say there's a new task. That's the subtitle: a new function of the church in North American Christianity. And that is the liberation of the poor. And their proposal is that up to the level of saving souls and getting people to love each other, that equally as important, and so equally in the budget, sort of equally in staff time and so forth, there needs to be a process of liberating the poor. So then I've been working for a while collecting materials out of my career because it was almost entirely justice oriented. So I decided to, my book was Organizing Justice Church. I'm not a theologian in the same level as this book is written. I accept this as the theological basis. Oh,
Nice organ, yeah.
Darn organ, you know, it's so
You
loud.
gotta love it.
So what I primarily see myself as is an organizer and working with congregations, working with groups within congregations. You'll hear a little bit about that to implement, to build, to organize the Justice Church. So that's the main flow of this. Just a couple of more facts. I was a minister for 40 years in the United Church of Christ. I still am ordained, but I'm in retirement. I kind of realized next April I'm going to turn 90. And that means from some audiences I speak to, there's this huge generation or 2 or 3 generation gap. I was in an intergenerational class that had a lot of undergraduates from the Claremont colleges, and I told the story. And the punchline was Joan Baez, somebody that I'd talked to before she became famous. I said Joan Baez, my punchline. There wasn't a single undergraduate who shook their heads like they knew what I just said. One of the women said, I'm sure that would be an important person if we knew who it was.
There's a documentary.
Yes, there is. There's a new documentary, right?
Yeah. This book has a lot of people from the Joan Baez era, and this audience will recognize most of the things that I believe. Okay, the question I want to ask, Jen and I are going to take turns or share in the process of reading small sections of the book that, taken together, I think tells a story. That's what we were trying to do when we were going through getting ready for today. So the question behind this section is, how did I get originally radicalized as a right-handed, white-faced, straight hair, from an intact family? I don't know, I have a whole bunch of those privileges. And how did I get radicalized? Well, here's a big part of the story. 1953, on a Christmas break at home from my studies at the University of Missouri, I got a job working as a short-term temporary worker for the U.S. Postal Service. Mail delivery reached its peak during the Christmas season and extra workers were needed. I was assigned to the post office that served the Pruitt-Igoe housing towers and areas nearby. It was the post office that served the most segregated and poverty-stricken postal zone. Twice a day, I delivered the same route for 2 weeks. The exposed stairs, the hallways were wooden and stuck to the outside of the 3-story brick buildings. There was no interior hallway and no elevators. I showed up at 6 a.m. at the post office, filled my bag with the deliveries for each trip, and hiked 6 blocks to the start of the route. At the end of the first round, I stopped at an auxiliary mailbox to which the mail for my second round had been delivered. I was given a special key to open the box. I was a federal employee, an agent of the United States government. I wore a mailman's hat, but my own coat, gloves, scarf, and boots. So I walked these exposed stairs and hallways and experienced a lot of silence from residents who saw me. I was the stranger, the outsider. This was a very black area, and I did not have a clue about what to expect or prepare for. I was not sure what was happening as I made my rounds. People either stared at me in silence or looked away. It was easy to see the terrible conditions of poverty. This book, this look into the lives of people experiencing poverty, caused a scar on my soul. the tavern on my route was open and noisy. Silence fell when I entered. Everything came to a halt, all eyes trained on the white kid with the mailbag over his shoulder. I dropped the tavern mail on the bar where the bartender pointed and departed. The noise restarted immediately, but my second day I realized that the noise was loud rhythmic music playing on the jukebox, playing tunes I did not know. And the noise was also boisterous laughter and loud banter. They were, as far as I could tell, all men, all black. The third day, in the quiet, I put my mail down and I said to the bartender, "Merry Christmas." The fourth day, he said, "Merry Christmas," back to me. And the fifth day, the noise did not stop when I entered. Only me. I was no longer a threat. Only the bartender could hear the exchange of Christmas greetings. I was no longer a full outsider. I was no longer worth stopping the party for. Two men waved as I left on my last delivery. I have reflected now on this experience. I treasure it. I remain curious about the big sound of laughter and fun that I heard. It was not like anything I ever heard in a bar full of white people. I remain convinced that there was a lot of good stuff going on out there, stuff that I probably would not be permitted to experience with them. My whiteness was a barrier. I was curious about the life lived in those apartments where I delivered mail, but there was life there too. But I was an outsider to it. I felt something had broken open in me, an awareness that has been part of me since. I have.
That's really good.
Why don't you read that last?
Yeah. When the eyes fail, it begins to be a problem. I've debriefed that experience with African-American friends through the years. Why were these men in the bar during the day? No jobs. They wanted jobs. When they got a job, they were not in the bar. They came together to keep their spirits up. They shared their pain and sense of uselessness. That's most of what I was told. I learned that immersion in a new experience was a faster, more powerful way to learn than reading books. And I promised myself I would always remember this experience and use this memory to keep myself engaged in working for justice. You can go to the next one.
Yeah, but let me introduce it. So that's the personal kind of conversion experience that I had. I carried that with me through several jobs, but never found a focus. How am I going to get into this kind of activity?
Paul got fired from a couple of churches and was in his third short-term appointment when this experience happened at the Church of the Chimes in Thousand Oaks, Van Nuys.
Well, it was Van Nuys, now it's Sherman Oaks.
Sherman Oaks, okay. A life-shaping event occurred on a January 1964 morning. I was still uncertain about how to direct my ministry. At my desk at the church, I came across a line from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. from an 1884 Memorial Day speech in Keene, New Hampshire. He was reflecting on the generation that had fought the Civil War 20 years earlier. Some men had volunteered, some not. He said to them, "I think that as life is action and passion, it is required of us that we should share the passion and action of our time at peril of being judged not to have lived." That rumbled around in my head a while and ended up requiring me to ask myself, what are the actions and passions of my time and how do I share in them? Answering these questions set the agenda for the rest of my life. My task as a human being and a Christian was to share in the action and passion of my time. I was not to be a spectator for my time in history. I was not to be the object of history, but a shaper of it. My vision of being a pastoral counselor sitting in my study doing one-on-one healing was gone. My new mission was to locate the action and passion and to find my way in. In 1964, I identified these 5 as my list of action and passion in my time. What I could see were the big, hard, open questions before the society, and were questions that the church had resources to bring to the work. The issues were the following: war and peace, poverty, population control, civil rights, civil liberties. Of course, looking back, I missed the abortion issue, the women's movement, gay rights, and the environment, among others. Population control became a concern for world hunger. I must have prepared this list prior to my theology classes with the teachers, who were all women, or I would not have missed the women's movement. To get grounded on these issues, I began a search for people and organizations that were already deeply engaged in these issues. Let me just go on with the wonderful.
Great writing, that's good stuff.
The call Paul got from being in that position, which, as I said, was a temporary position, excuse me, was from the conference office to ask him to go to Pacoima, where there was a church that was struggling financially, had moved from being in a white neighborhood to a ghetto and barrio, but the church was still all white. So how does it function there? The conference agreed to fund it part-time, to fund Paul's salary as long as the congregation would pay for the work. And so the question of what's this church going to be was the question that Paul had with all these questions as he walked in. And here's what he says to kind of launch this section. The mission question we needed to answer, thank you, was how our church could bring justice and connection to our parish. What did we need to know and do to become a justice church? Parish was not a familiar concept in my experience of American Protestantism. We had our people out there in the community, and the Methodists, Presbyterians, etc., had theirs. To think that all who lived in the surrounding community were, in some sense, ours was new. Since that was the assumption we made, we realized we didn't have a clue about most of those folks. So the church needed some form of engagement with the community. Most of the members of the church agreed that for the month of April 1965, we would cancel all church activities, committees, and meetings except for Sunday morning worship. Most young clergy bent on renewing the church in that era started by renewing Sunday morning worship experience. I saved that for the end of the process. I pushed for change in the established program and structure and kept Sunday morning familiar and traditional, start at the edges and keep the center stable. We freed up a lot of time for mission. Leadership and many members of our church signed up for this, as did people from the Church of the Chimes, the Sherman Oaks Church. Women from the study groups and their spouses were attracted to the adventure. Some community activists in Pacoima heard of our effort and joined us. We reflected a lot on the image of the dividing wall of hostility found in Ephesians 2:14, where Paul wrote about the wall between Christians and Jews. Our wall ran down Laurel Canyon Boulevard at that time, and it was between whites on one side and brown and black people on the other. We knew we had to take initiative to break down that wall. The women agreed to get their hair done at one of the 3 hairdressers, choosing among the 2 who served primarily black women or the one that served Latinas. The men got their haircuts at Super Bob's or Joe's Barbershop. On laundry days, the families went to either Lila's Laundromat or Henry's Wash and Dry. The point was to meet neighbors, the people on the other side of the dividing wall of race, to ask about their children, their favorite grocery store, their experiences with the schools, or their biggest worry, and to do it in their space where they were at home and we were the outsiders. Our Pacoima time tellers, as we called them, were while bold in buying into the program, were hesitant to get out of the car at Joe's Barbershop, at Lila's, at the Wash and Dry. I'm amazed that so many were able to take those steps, who experienced their own courage in a new way. Some were clear it was not something they could bring themselves to do. As the early explorers began to report back, word quickly spread that this exposure yielded many dividends: friendships, new understandings, confrontation with new realities, and many funny stories. People enjoyed telling stories about themselves, standing at their front door with a laundry bag over their shoulders and being unable to find the doorknob to get out. To their surprise, all who tried found hairstylists who knew how to do white people's hair. We had learned how to ask questions, and there were 100 new questions to ask when we finished reviewing our period of plunge into Black and Latino Pacoima on the other side of the wall. Others found in these reports encouragement to launch their own experiences. The courage it took to follow through on these commitments was huge. Just those simple actions generated so much information, so many questions, and such emotion, we didn't know how to process it all. We had several meetings to share our experience and to try to push what we had learned and what we had experienced into some conclusions that would shape our decision about mission. We gathered in small groups to share what we felt, what we learned, with what and whom we had connected. I asked, what do we now know about our parish? The month's immersion and several months of reflection produced action proposals. We brought the list down to 2 projects that had been clearly identified by the parish that were perhaps doable with current resources, that had an impact on the lives of people, and that had promising prospects for future fundraising and volunteers. We decided that our church would organize to meet the need for early childhood education, preparation of all the children, and especially children from Spanish-speaking families for entry into public school kindergarten, setting up a preschool for children of families we met and for others that they recruited was our priority. Our folks figured this out for themselves after making connections across the dividing wall and listening to the priorities of those they met. And I just would say as a footnote, this remembers 1965, and this preschool became one of the models for the Head Start program nationally. That comes later in the book, we're not going to read that part. We also committed ourselves to developing a proposal to address youth gang issues, namely conflict among Latino gangs, including 2 in San Fernando, and between Latino gangs and a Black gang. We had no clue where this would end up. A lot could have gone wrong, but this was the path to which we were now committed. Keep going. Yep. Okay. Paul spent several years, I don't remember years, sorry about that, in that church. They did lots of radical kind of stuff, anti-Ku Klux Klan out rallies. Paul went to Selma. There was a whole bunch, the late 60s, there was a lot going on, and that church was very actively involved in trying to help people find jobs and do all sorts of stuff. At the end of that time, Paul was invited to join a training center for churches located in Los Angeles, an urban training center that from this congregation, Jim Merrill and Spike Murray both participated in training programs, right? Project Understanding and Plunges.
And somebody else.
I don't remember, well, I know those 2 anyway, that they did training for how to enable church members to figure out how to do this kind of work, go into your community, ask the questions, even when you're scared because you don't speak the language or you don't know the culture or you're the oddball out. How do you learn some skills to listen? How do you listen in that environment? And the other thing that Paul did at that, when he was at that urban training center, was that he worked full-time as an organizer against the war in Vietnam, which you already heard Jacob speak to. At the end of that time, in 1968, a colleague, a seminary classmate of Paul's, invited him to go to Washington, D.C. to head up the Washington office of the United Church of Christ, which is a whole different set of skills. So our guy who was training people how to be skilled had to retool completely himself because Washington's a different scene. But in 1968, Washington was very different from Washington today. There was an effort to work together to try to get things done for the common good, and so on. And excuse me, you were there in 1974. In 1974, that was the case. And so Paul participated in helping to write legislation, how to organize local pew sitters, as I always called them. I worked in Washington too, to get local pew sitters to speak to their members of Congress to say, we support this. The church never had money, but the church had people, and we all can talk to our members of Congress and we vote. Money is not the only thing that votes. So that was an active part of what was going on. And just Paul wanted to share with you just a sample of some congressional testimony that he gave in 1983 after President Reagan had come to office. And President Reagan's goal thought the government was the problem, not rather than the solution. He said that publicly all the time. He campaigned on that. And so some of the things that we had been doing very easily all of a sudden became very difficult. And the president recommended that we that the Congress reduce the programs that support low-income people dramatically. And so in 1983, the Senate, one of the Senate committees was trying to figure out, are the anti-hunger programs that we do, domestic nutrition and food programs that we do, are they effective? How do you know about that? So a group of people were invited to testify about that. And I'm going to share with you just a tiny bit of what Paul said that was his background, not his policy recommendations, but the background that he offered at that testimony in 1983. We sat together at a long table facing the raised platform on which the committee members sat behind their table. We had our names on plaques in front of us so senators could address us by name. We each had a microphone and a glass of water. Thank you for the water, by the way. I felt that if this testimony were to be delivered as well as it was written, it might positively influence the way the Senate committee dealt with the hunger issue. If that turned out to happen, it would confirm my sense that this public policy work can make a difference, can bring food to the table of hungry people. It could actually be an important thing to be doing. Each of us, that's the people who were speaking, brought to the table a perspective on the question before the subcommittee: how effective are the government's food and nutrition programs? My testimony that morning had 2 points. One was to offer our theological framework for thinking about these important questions. The opening addressed that point, and this is the testimony. Based on our biblical faith and our understanding of traditions of the church, it is our belief that God is a God of justice, who promises to establish justice in history and to demand that those who are claimed by God work for justice. And we believe that while God loves all people, and through that love seeks justice for all people, God makes what theologian John Bennett calls a concentration of love on the needy. Equal concern for all requires unequal attention when unequal need exists. We believe that God judges nations by the standard of justice. The divine standard is not the size of the nation's gross national product, the beauty of its worship places, or the frequency of its prayer breakfasts. The divine standard is justice, which means first and foremost how a nation deals with the weak, the needy, and the vulnerable. For the God of biblical faith, the litmus test of whether a nation is just or unjust, of whether its economy is fair or unfair, is always the question: what is happening to the poor? Sorry about that. The current public policy toward the poor of this nation leads many of us to conclude that by this exacting standard, America is to be judged harshly. Our second point was to respond to a growing interest among legislators to move the care of the poor from the federal budget to voluntary charitable organizations such as, and especially, the church. Our argument was that this thinking was moving the care of the poor from justice, as secured by the government acting on behalf of the whole people, to charity. That would be putting the poor at the mercy of the whims of charitable donors. Ronald Reagan was president, and he favored reducing, excuse me, I've got Bippy right on where I can't see, reducing the cost and responsibilities of government as they related to those with low income. He often said the government is not the solution, but is the problem. I said in my testimony, I think finally the question for us is to look at whether we are a nation which deals with its poor principally through mechanisms of charity or principally through the mechanisms of justice. We see it as a matter of justice. The poor need to be fed. They need to be fed in as many places as possible, and the government acting on behalf of the community of persons in this nation is going to be the instrument through which that justice is implemented. Now, this vision of this particular administration seems to be that we want to reduce that we want to shift it back to the realm of private charity, which means that for us, major portions of the population, those particularly who are weak and vulnerable and poor, will survive only if people who have material wealth are also morally perfect, that is, willing to give to charity. And that is a very thin reed, even with the best that the churches can do to address the problem. So I would say that the churches, of course, need to do more, have done a lot, but there are not resources in for that kind of charitable direction to meet the current need. And in 1984, Paul decided it was time for him to stop doing Washington, that it was time for something for him to get back to all of us. And so he said at the end of his Washington time, I entered the pastor seeking church process. At the end of an 8-month search, I was called to the First Congregational United Church of Christ in Santa Barbara, California. I had come to feel that my next period of ministry should be as pastor and teacher in the context of a congregation. I yearned for the Sunday worship leadership, experience serving communion, the teaching, weddings, memorial services, baptisms, visiting the sick, and all the other rich and important moments that make up the story of a local pastor. Back to you.
Yeah.
Wrap us up.
Well, we've got not just under 15 minutes. I want to read you one more thing, and then I'd like to have your
Questions.
questions, right? Hadn't planned this, but it's the last paragraph in the book. I watch and listen for signs in the churches of the awareness of this new task, liberating the poor. Are people engaging in connection with the poor? There is a lot of reasons why. I'm gonna cry. I love my mother-in-law, Mildred Denny. She provided one of the clearest signs of a Justice Church consciousness at her memorial service. A minister who had been a candidate to serve the church that Mildred was a member of, Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Fayetteville, Arkansas. This guy who was a candidate said Mildred was responsible for giving the candidates a tour of the city. Tour of the city. And when they got in the car, Mildred said, any minister of our church must know where the poor people live. That to me was a sign of, at least in crazy Mildred's heart. Okay. Glad for both of us to answer any questions you have or comments.
Peggy.
Well, it's very inspiring, but I have a different kind of question. Should I come up here?
Yeah,
So my question, I'm really impressed with your ability to have a broad picture of your professional efforts. You know, so many of us just sort of take the next thing. Well, now I need this, or we have to do that. So I'd be really interested in how you think you were able to develop that sense and that commitment to what's my purpose now. I think that's really,
Yeah.
yeah.
Spin this back around so you can be heard.
Mm-hmm.
Spin that back around so you can be heard.
It was, I think, I functioned that way with a lot of things in my life, including arguments with Janet. She's ready with one or two options and wants to debate those. No, let's step out and look at all these other factors that are at play.
Makes me crazy, I might say.
Falling down. But I really am committed, if I have a chance to talk to young seminarians, which I do occasionally, to say, get out there, leave the library. There are ways you can get smart a lot faster and with a lot more punch and power that leaves a scar on your soul and shapes who you're going to be by going where things are not familiar to you and where you feel threatened. You're just in the right place. And
That's good advice for all young people,
Yes.
not just seminarians.
Absolutely.
You know, go to the edge, I think you're saying.
I kind of see it.
Yeah, I would say not just young people, Peggy, it's advice for all of us to go to the edge. And how do we keep asking the questions that help us understand who is this world? This is just a quick note, but I just started reading a book that you all probably read called Solito, that is a superb writer, recognized writer. I forgotten his name right now. I apologize. Who?
Javier Zamora.
Javier Zamora, who is writes of his coming to the United States alone as a 9-year-old because his parents had already come, and that experience, and it is so outside my world, but it's not an immersion, but it is a way that I can get into his story to begin to open my brain to what in the world are we expecting people to do, and how can we function in a way that is empowering and liberating and not just jamming people down. It's a good book so far.
That was what I was going to say.
Except
That's
you're not
good
reading
advice
it.
for you guys.
Oh, yeah.
What doesn't make sense? I'm afraid to ask what does.
I have a question.
Sure.
You said you talked about your experience of radicalization, and so I'm guessing that you would identify it as a radical, or like, what does that mean to you, or how radical would you say?
Well, I got fired from the first 2 churches I served because I was making demands on it to be involved in ways that people were not comfortable doing, and they got tired of having me around. I think radical, as I was using it, was someone who asked the question, what's going on here? What's happening to our lives? Where's the, and what's happening to the poor? And ask those kind of questions. And then goes about trying to figure out how to get answers to that question, experiential answers to that question, and then makes program suggestions that come up out of that experience, like we did at the Appointment Church. And so we just functioned really differently than and saw the task of the church really differently than we had before.
Another quick example of work, I would say not so radical in the scheme of things. I mean, we're good, white, wealthy people here. What can you say? So I would say not radical in that sense, but radical in the way that Paul was talking about it. But when we were in Madison, the conference of the church there had a relationship with the Catholic bishop in Chiapas, Mexico, and there were a couple of UCC missionaries there that they were trying to figure out how can they get the local pew sitters to be involved in what's happening in Chiapas, Mexico, to understand what in the world is going on. This was in 98. The Zapatistas were trying to push hard against the Mexican government control of the oil and how things are working and pushing down people in the country. And so Paul said, well, shoot up, our church will go without talking to any guy. So he's that kind of guy, outside the box kind of guy. And a group of a dozen of us or so signed up to go on this trip. And we asked, what do people want us to do if we come, in addition to being a presence, because there was so much violence going on by paramilitaries that having good folk from North America there was really helpful, just so there was less violence. And the people in the parish that we visited said there were a group of them who said they wanted to work together cooperatively, because everybody growing a pig it doesn't make sense. You can get so many, I would call it cost benefit analysis stuff. You can see that you can save a lot in economies of scale. That was not the language they used, but how can we do something together? So among us, in the people who signed up, one of them was a professor in the business school at UW-Madison, and another one was a graduate student in business, and another was a professor at another place. And the guy who was the MBA guy wanted to know what's their business plan. And I want to make sure it's going to work before we go. And it was really a stretch for him and for all of us to say, no, they're going to decide how they're going to build the pigsty, what it's going to look like, what the business plan is, all that. We're just going to go down there and be common labor, and we're going to do what they say they want from us. And it was a really hard learning for many of us to just listen to what those folks wanted and how they thought they could do better if they just had an infusion of cash, which we took along, but they also had our time to help us do that. And there's a lot more. La Migra came after. The immigration folks took our passports and all. We had all kinds of stuff. They ran stories that we came down to run guns. which most of us didn't even know what a gun was, but anyway, it was really complicated and very scary. I'm here to tell you, I was terrified at some times. When you get left alone with only Spanish speaking people and you're one of those people who never bothered to learn, stupid that you are, but you didn't do that. It can be a frightening experience. And so we had some really terrifying times there, but we also had some really unbelievably moving times. So that's not radical, but it's trying to stretch us, trying to move us a little bit so that we can get beyond our stuck places, I think. One more comment and then we're gonna have to split, I think. Peggy's got another. Go for it, Peggy.
I do. Well, there are more. Anyway.
Keep talking, Peggy. It's good.
I'm curious about the impact of all of this on your children. What do they say today as adults that all meant to them?
Is one of them online?
I sent them the link to this
Oh, okay.
Zoom.
Is anybody out there?
No, none of them. Paul's sister is, but it's
My sister in South Carolina is online.
Spin it around.
It was part of the story we didn't tell is when my kids were in early elementary school, we moved into Pacoima so I could do my ministry there. And we enrolled them in schools that were the lowest performing schools in the LA Unified School District. And they had friends who were really, really poor, and they had all kinds of racial people and kids in their class. So it's clear to me they're really comfortable in places that I didn't grow up be comfortable in. They just the way the world is the way they learned it in that elementary school. And of course they're perfect. I think they're perfect, guys.
We're a second marriage, so they're not biologically my kids. I didn't have this experience with them, but I would say for each of them, there are things that happened during that time that they recall that really inform how they approach the world now. As Paul just said, there are things that were really hard that they can talk about. One in particular really struggles about what that meant to get kind of cut off from your own people, because I was in a school district where I loved the people I knew and so on. But I think it's been, it's something we talk about. So I hear their stories about what that meant, and they are still in touch with some of the kids they met during that time. I mean, it was a really, really important learning for them. And the way they walk into a room is really different from how Paul walked into a room, or even still doesn't walk, he wheels into a room, but it's really a very different, who do you talk to first conversation, or if you see somebody alone, how do you function with them, is very, very different. We need to quit, but I would say a couple more things if I could. When he turned 80, Paul started painting. Some of you know that story. There are cards up here. He's got an art opening happening on the 18th of November in Ontario. Please go if you can. You can go on his website, which was up here. Is it still here? Back there a little bit. There is information about, there's just his business card here, and there are books here if you want to buy a book, or you can online, you can order it too. So,
or Peggy took one.
Peggy took one already.
And she's going to
She's
mail
gonna,
us
it's a check. We trust you. We know how to
So
find
if any of
you.
you would, if you have $27, I'd take it. If you're interested, but if you don't, you can take it. And, people know where you live, so.
Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it that you
Thanks a
came to
lot.
listen to it.